Hallelujah. What Shepherd John don't know is that this was his word, his message. And so I just got to take the dictation and stand up here in his place. And what an honor it is to be able to stand here and hear, knowing that you've heard a word from Abba, and to be able to bring that word. And I just want to challenge you. If you could just turn me down just a little bit. Bring a cup of water in the name of a prophet and receive a prophet's reward. I want to challenge you, those that are in the house and those of you that are listening. Some of you are listen quite often. And there are times that you get so accustomed to hearing a message from Shepherd John or myself or Brittany, and it can become something that you get kind of desensitized to. Oh yeah, it's a good word. But I am here to tell you that what he has been sharing for the last several months has been a very powerful prophetic word regarding the season we're living in. And each word, each message, and the successing message behind it has been building one upon another. And I believe with all my heart that he's getting you, if you've been listening to these messages, he is getting you prepared for what is coming. Are you listening? There's some very difficult days on the horizon. Desperate times we're already beginning to feel the pressures of that. But we're reminded by his word that though we're in the world, we're not of the world. And desperate times has a tendency to produce a desperate people. And desperate people will begin to cry out to their Elohim, knowing that he is, in fact, their deliverer and the only source of deliverance that they have hope for. And when the children of Israel began to cry out in Egypt, their cries ascended into the heavens, and that's when Abba began to move and activate on their behalf. And I'm telling you, he has already launched his minions, his armies. I don't like the word minions. He's already launched his angels, his Melchizedek on your behalf. They've been dispatched. And I'm here also to tell you that there's some things that are about to happen to reveal your particular loyalty to your king. And I hear so many people that are out there, especially as on the quote-unquote teaching circuit in the Christian community, in the Hebrew roots and Messianic communities, and they all, by times they'll beat their chest and they talk about their king. But what I want to share with you is that what's heading for our community in the days in front of us, it's going to define really who your king is. And as we consider last week, what we were looking at was the tabernacle tent and the shadow pictures that we saw inherent in his word in the Torah Portion, Naso. And we saw the role of Aaron and the Kohanim and then the sons of Levi as it had to do with their custodial responsibilities to that tabernacle tent, that tent man. And we know everything that we can look at regarding end-time prophecy, eschatology, is going to be looked at through the lens of how you view the Levitical system and the coming establishment of the third temple. It is going to be built. But I'm telling you, if the king that you beat your chest so fervently with or about is not welcome in the third temple, you need to give me an answer as to why not. Because if he's not welcome in the third temple, and at present, if he arrived on the scene, he would not be welcome. He would have to convert. And therefore, unless you convert to Judaism, and here I don't want to be called anti-Semitic because I'm not. I'm not against my brothers Judah. I'm not against the Levites. But I am wholeheartedly against anyone who will not recognize Messiah Yeshua as our king in this earth and serve him with every fiber of our being. That's the line of demarcation, if you will. And so prayerfully, with the unction of the Holy Spirit, he will allow me to share with you what I've been seeing in this Torah portion. And we pondered the role of Aaron and the sons of Levi in last week's study. And we looked at the pattern in relationship, as I said, to the tabernacle man in the wilderness, that we called and simplified it by calling it the tent of meeting. And I want you to remember that. Put that down, tent of meeting, if you're able to take some notes. But what we're going to see is more of a picture of their role as messianic precursors. I believe with all my heart that the house of Levi actually functioned in a messianic role. They were there to help lead the people as mediators between the people and Yahweh to the one who would come later, who would be the Messiah. And what I want to look at is how they handled that role. We spent some time last week delving into it. If you haven't looked at that study, by all means, you should go back. And we looked at their custodial obligations and how long their obligations lasted and what role, if any, Levi has to play in the third temple that is coming and the priestly order of our righteous king, the Melchizedek, and how I believe those two are going to be juxtaposed in the day ahead, and you're going to have to choose whom you're going to serve. So as we continue with what I'm referring to as part 2, I want to examine this tabernacle or tent of meeting. So hopefully it'll give you a little bit more of a closer view of the relationship of Levi regarding this tent and the perspective that's needed with the original intended pattern of the tent of meeting, the skin tent, and the relationship of that skin tent with the fallen Adam. And there may be some things that you'll hear in this particular part 2, that you may not quite understand. You should go back and listen to part 1 so that you'll realize that the skin tent in the wilderness, as I'm referring to, is actually a shadow picture of the fallen Adam, who was given a skin tent of flesh after the Genesis 3 encounter with the Nakash at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And from that time forward, death resided inside this skin tent vessel. And the wilderness tent, the wilderness tabernacle, was a pattern designed to show you the frailty of that skin tent man. And that skin tent man was in need of a redeemer. And the only way that man could be redeemed was someone who would come in the same kind of vessel without sin, and thus redeem that man of the sin and death curse that was upon his life. The shed blood of bulls and goats could never do that. I'm going to show you in this teaching this afternoon the purpose for the sacrificial offerings in the wilderness of the blood that required the blood of bulls and goats. Can you say amen? What most people fail to remember is that this skin tent was originally actually set up outside the camp. Last week we talked about the tent being inside a circular encampment with the Levites encircling it, and then a greater circle, if you will, concentric lines being formed by the other tribes. But if you go back and read Exodus chapter 33, verse 7, after the golden calf incident, this tent was taken outside the camp and set up. Now, there are a lot of people who consider this, go back and they make some presumptions, and they presume that this earlier tent that was set up outside the camp was actually a temporary tent in regards to the latter tent that we studied last week in Numbers chapter 2, verse 17. Now, we covered, I felt like, very clearly and carefully, man, I gave you numerous witnesses. The scriptures tell us that everything needs to be established in the mouth of at least 2 witnesses. And if you're not doing your due diligence to go and search these matters out, Yahweh hides things. It's the glory of the king to hide things. It's your duty, it's your obligation to search things out, just like 2 Timothy 2:15 says. If you take what I say on its face value and don't go and research it for yourself and become vested in it, then you can be unconvinced just as well as I can convince you. Amen? We covered the purpose of the cyclical encampment and the role of Levi, who completely encompassed that tent. They completely surrounded, embraced it, if you will. And by doing so, go back and read last week's notes, you'll find that they actually served, again, as a messianic figure, they served to protect, like Messiah would put his back to the lictors as the blood would be spilled there because of the plagues of the firstborn that would fall on the houses. He put his back to the lictors, and he received the wrath of Yahweh in the stead of the children of Israel. The Levites played that same role. They would encircle that original skin tent to prevent the wrath, the death, from exuding out of that skin tent and falling on the nation of a whole. So we've looked at the tent as it was inside that circular encampment, but what about the earlier temporary tent that was outside the camp? What kind of relationship does it have to do with the children of Israel, with the house of Levi, and the coming third temple, and the living stones tabernacle that's not made with hand? Well, for you to understand that, you need to remember once again, according to what we see in the scripture, that the reason it was set outside the camp was because of the golden calf incident, when Israel prostituted themselves to a fallen deities that they had been prone to serving while they were still in bondage, remember? Okay? And so for you to understand this, you have to go back and return to what I believe was the first parallel of the golden calf incident. And some may say, well, I don't see a golden calf or a molten calf in that text that you're about to reveal. You will if you'll just hold on. And that first incidence of a golden calf being formed and worshipped, I believe, can be found in Genesis chapter 3, where in chapter 2 and 3, we'll set the stage for you. And you see Adam being warned of contact with one of two specific trees that are referenced set in the middle of the Garden of Eden. The first one he was told to have contact with, and that was the tree of life. But there was another tree called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. I like to refer to it as the tree of carnal knowledge. And Adam was told, of this particular tree, you are not to eat. And then he was told of the repercussions that he would receive if he did in fact eat of it. And now the word for eat there in the King James English, literally, most of you think of it as sitting at a dinner table, if you will, dining on something, actually taking it inside your mouth and consuming. Well, if you look at it in the Hebrew language, the word akal does mean to eat or to consume, but it actually has a very more profound and deeper meaning than you would ever imagine if you just take the time to go back and look at the individual letters in that word akal and the meaning that was put inside the pictures. And it gives you more of an overview of what akal, or to eat or consume, literally means as it relates to consuming something from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It sounds as if that there was fruit on this tree, just like there was fruit on the tree of life. And that if you eat of the fruit of this particular tree, you get your hand slapped, and then there'll be some repercussions. But it was far more than that. And you and I are living right now the repercussions of Adam going back and akal, or consuming things from that tree. Let's look at that. Aleph, Kamed, Kamed, Kaf and Lamed. That's when your tang gets tangled. Aleph, Kav, and Lamed. The Aleph gives us an idea, if you will, a picture of the strong one, the father, the husband. While the Hebrew letter Kaf, if you go back and look at the pictograph of it, it was actually an idea of the hand, the palm of the hand, or the insole, the instep of the foot, and it always represented ownership, title deed, authority. But it could also indicate as if I had something inside this hand and I would cover it with another, so it could indicate to cover something or to uncover it. Something that's hidden or something that's being revealed. Now, as we continue, if you look at the Hebrew letter lamed, the lamed always was used to point towards the shepherd, a shepherd's staff, a goad, if you will. And the purpose of the lamed being attached to the kaf, the authority and ownership is almost as if it's static. It doesn't have any initiative of its own. And so the lamed points to the individual who has the authority or the control over ownership. Does that make sense? And it's not an accident also that the Hebrew letter lamed points toward the tongue as well. The tongue is pretty interesting because you see lashon, the Hebrew word for tongue, and we understand even the rabbis believe that lashon hara, an evil tongue, was what caused people to be consumed, if you will, by leprosy and death. Now, I want to just stop there and insert something parenthetically. From a scientific standpoint, it has been proven that whatever you consume literally becomes part of your DNA. How many of you are doing your best to eat healthy? Why? Because you have found out unhealthy eating has a tendency to affect your body. Do you understand what I'm talking about? Physiologically, physically, mentally, spiritually. Do you know that there are some things that you can consume that literally will dull your senses? Are you listening to me? This is important because we're talking about eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so this word, akal, actually indicates that whatever is being consumed, whether it's physical spoken, a physical food or spoken seed, remember the lashon, you can have verbal intercourse, you can have words spoken, and then you receive them, you have literally consumed them. Are you hearing me? And so whatever is consumed has the ability to become the strong man in your life. And it's that strong man that will exercise authority and control in you and over you. And then it will also affect your own personal individual authority and your own personal ownership as it regards your inheritance. Remember that in Genesis chapter 3. Whatever you consume, whether it's physical food that has the ability to affect your mental ability to think, to be cognizant of things that's going on around you. It has the ability to affect your physical body, but it also has a spiritual connotation as well. Whatever you allow to come inside this body, the words that are spoken to you, or against you, or towards you, or for you, they literally, if you're not careful, they have the ability to become a stronghold in your life. They can become strong men. And they will affect your ability to administer what Abba's given you authority over. Does that make sense? Now, as we noted, Adam did in fact eat. He eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And in Genesis 2, he's warned, if you do eat of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, in the day that you do, you shall surely die. Now, I want you to understand something. That definition of consume, when you read this in the King James English, all you're actually thinking of from a Western mindset is consuming a fruit or something from that tree, right? But this word consume includes intercourse of any kind, sexual, verbal. Whatever you receive on the inside of you, you need to remember this because it's going to be very pertinent to us in the days ahead. It has the ability to alter your DNA. Did you realize whatever you hear has the ability to affect you? Many of us, listen to me, if this earth continues for another 1,000 years and they exhume a lot of graves, archaeological experts will find a lot of individuals with their hands like this, and they'll wonder what happened. Why were they just with their hands like this? And it will be because of the electronic devices that you have become addicted to. And those electronic devices are having verbal intercourse with you. And as you pay attention to what's being said there, you need to remember there's something releasing seed on the other side. And when you allow that seed, you are literally standing at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and the Nakash, the enchanter, is speaking to you. Now, some of it may be legitimate. I use it as a tool. I joke with my son all the time. His is a toy, mine's a tool. And I do that to kind of justify the time that I spend with it. But my point is we need to be very careful. Shepherd and John and I were talking yesterday. We were both traveling 2 different times, listening to 2 different messages. And in this message, and he'll stand here to verify what I'm saying, it was talking about artificial intelligence. And that artificial intelligence, as we speak, Google has an AI entity that's already been created. It has the ability to do billions of thought processes, if you will. There's another one that's coming out in 3 months that has 500 billion times more. It's in the trillion. The ability to do trillions of thought processes. The one that's out now already has the ability to think for itself and it's actually exerting its own rights. Don't mess with me. Listen to me. These things are coming. The one that's going to be on the scene 3 months from now is going to be connected to every electronic device that you have. And the individual that was speaking has working knowledge of it. And what he said was that this particular AI is going to become the executive secretary for every human on the planet. Oh, it's going to make it so easy for you. For all of your record keeping to be taken care of, for all of your business to be handled, for everything that you do that takes your time, this artificial intelligence is going to think for you. Listen, yeah, did you hear what I said? It's going to do your thinking. It's going to talk for you. It's going to filter out what you need to hear so that it can get the junk mail or the spam out before you get what you need. Are you hearing me? These things are coming. And the day that you eat of that tree, you shall surely die. Now, the phrase surely die in the King James English carries the idea of an instantaneous dying. But the Hebrew language has a very powerful phrase, and that phrase is mut tamut. And if you look at mut tamut, it actually does connote death as being instantaneous, but it's different than just something instantaneously laying down, because Adam's physical body did not lay down and expire at that particular moment. Death instantly began to work in him, but it took 930 years for his physical body to actually lay down and die. The phrase mut tamut actually indicates that death is not only, listen to this is mind-staggering. Death is not only working in you, listen to me carefully, but death is now working through me. If death is working through me, it means that there's some repercussions to what I just did by eating from this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, far more than just what will affect me. How could death be working through me? Death is in my DNA, so every time that I attempt to reproduce myself, death now is being passed on to all of my progeny, so I'm responsible for all of my generations dying. Are you hearing that? Death is instant in part, and yet it continues to work its instrument of destruction in us. In Adam's case, as I said, his fleshly body was immediately changed, but it did not actually lay down and expire. It took 930 years. However, the spiritual man known as the Adam dies instantly and is separated from the presence of Yahweh. Now let me ask you this again. And this is just real simple, reasonable deduction. If my flesh is going to soon be cut off, how could death be working through me when that happens? Again, as I was sharing with you, it passes into my DNA. It's in my physiological makeup, and so it's going to affect my offspring. This is the root of many generational curses that you find families burdened with and needing deliverance from. Are you hearing me? Someone prior to you ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and it's in their DNA makeup, and that has been passed on to you, and you need to understand that so that you can get in a place where you can break those things off of you. Immortality. As long as Adam was in the presence of Abba in the Garden of Eden, he was an immortal individual. Eternity had no effect on him because death did not work in him. But because of Adam's fall, Adam had to be severed from the presence of Yahweh, and now mortality works in man. Now I want you to note at the etymology of the word mortality. You have the word mort, which means death, and then you have the suffix ality, which indicates having the properties of. And so an individual who is a mortal man, he literally has the properties of death working in him, and even more so, this is what's staggering. It's more than just having the properties of death working in me. I now become the property of death. Did you hear that? Death has a title to you in a legal form until such time as you prove you're not a dead man. This is the key to redemption. The same thing can be said in the material world. You have mortgages. You have birth certificates. Everything that pertains to you in an all caps name is addressed to a dead man. And you need to know how to be set free. How can I be redeemed from this curse of death? Romans tells us that because of one man's sin, death entered the world, and death by sin, and it took the entrance of the Messiah, Yeshua, to bring life to all men. And you have to decide, am I a mortal or an immortal individual? Do I have death working in me or not? Look at that word, mut tamut, the phrase. It has a numeric value of 1,292. And if you subtract from that the years of Adam's life, 930, you're left with 362. And people might say, you know, I don't know how you folks just spend the time to go pull this out and make it fit right. I don't do this to make it fit. This is here. Okay, it's an alphanumeric language. Yahweh built it in here, so I have to look for it, but I don't have to make it fit. There's no such thing as a square peg that I'm trying to drive in this round hole. Are you listening? And so you're left with a remainder of 362. 362 is the value of a Hebrew word, mishkav, which is a word meaning sexual intercourse. Listen, death is working in the Adam, mut tamut, and the length of the tenure of Adam's life comes from a word that means sexual intercourse is working in him. And it comes from the root of the word masak, and that word literally means to remove something out of their position. Adam was moved out of his kingly, priestly role and placed somewhere else. And it was also can indicate to prolong something, and idiomatically, the idea of sowing seed in something or someone. Are you beginning to see the picture that's painted here? The result of Adam's sexual interaction with the Nakash, and I know there's an argument there, it didn't literally happen. It doesn't matter because verbal intercourse can take place and seed is planted in you. And it resulted in Adam being moved from his rightful position in the earth, as I said, as priest king, and it prolonged the length of time his seed would also be in that position, state, and condition. We were there 4,000 years until such time as the Redeemer of mankind came in the same skin tint vessel to remove that curse from us. Now, many of you probably recognize the Mem, Shin, Kaf root. It is from that particular root that we get our English word mask. And so I just wanted to throw this out. We probably have tried to forget that. How many of you tried to just forget the last couple of years when everybody had to be masked up? Come on, you might as well say, doesn't take long for you to forget it. By reading this, you should also see the intent of the elite in beguiling or masking you, just as the Nakash or the serpent beguiled Adam and Eve at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and whispered in their ear, hath God said, while he was being intimate with them. And as a result, if you were out of fear forced into masking up, you were literally moved out of your position, your status as priest and king in the earth. Now you know why the outcasts are being gathered. It's all about men being raised from the dead and restored to their rightful place in the earth. The outcasts are being gathered right now for this express purpose. You are being raised from the dead. You may not understand that from a natural perspective. You can only see it from a spiritual connotation because of the work of Messiah in us and the blood that's applied to our life. Yes, we are crucified with him, yet not I, but the life that I now live, I live in the flesh because of what he did for me. And even though I'm still in this fleshly body, I now will never see the taste of death in this spirit man. Are you listening to me? But it also has an application in the natural realm. The outcasts are being gathered from out of the dead places and being restored to their rightful place as kings and priests in the earth. Amen? Now, as we fast forward to where we are in this particular portion that we've been looking at for the last two teachings, they're at Mount Sinai. And you know the story. Israel had been exiled in Egypt, which again is a foreshadowing of death. Egypt is known as sin, darkness, Sheol, Hades, hell, the grave. And we also saw as they were extricated from Egypt that they went through a mikvah, a ritual mikvah in the Red Sea, which was a symbolic typology, if you will, of death and burial and a subsequent resurrection. And they were brought, as they exited the Red Sea, they're brought to the mountain, and they're giving the terms of a wedding contract. Now, it's interesting. I want you to pay close attention because This wedding contract is a covenant trust, and it contains a bridal price. You need to pay close attention here, because the price is the death of the testator, the one who originated this trust, and the one who guarantees the trust also is guaranteeing the life of the bride as a successor to him and a beneficiary at the same time. And you can see this in Ephesians chapter 4, where it says, "Wherefore he saith, he ascended up on high, and now that he led captivity captive, he gave gifts unto men. And now that he ascended, what is it but that he also descended first into the lower parts of the earth? He that descended is the same also that ascended up far above all heavens, that he might fulfill all things." And listen to me, you need to focus on the fact that he gave gifts unto men. That was, again, the initiation of a covenant contract that would release Israel right here at Mount Sinai, release us again when he appeared the first time and was executed and then resurrected. It would again release us from that curse. Now, this third temple and all of those that's going to officiate it do not recognize currently the bridal price paid by the testator known as Yeshua. And if they don't, then how could a third temple be the rightful throne of Yahweh in the earth? The trust covenant is a covenant regarding his redemption plan, and it cannot have a dead man and a dead building as successors or beneficiaries. Are you hearing me? Now, after that pattern, the resurrection of our Messiah purchased life for the bride. After his death, burial, and resurrection, it purchased life for the bride. Listen to me. This was what was intended to take place with Israel, at Mount Sinai. Israel was offered the same terms of this trust document, this covenant trust. And they answered in the affirmation that you see in the text. It says, "All that you have said, we will do." And so in exchange, just like the bride, listen to me carefully, because I've taught on this a number of times, I was going to carry us back to Eden in the not too distant future. And we will be put back in him. We will literally become echad with him. And so while they're at Mount Sinai, Israel could have experienced the same return of that Edenic, listen to me carefully, and or immortal state of life that had been formerly enjoyed by the Adam. Did you hear that? They could have been transformed from mortal to immortal by accepting the plan of redemption of Yeshua presented at Mount Sinai, and they rejected it. Now you have to remember, Adam was the first Melchizedek, the righteous king and priest while he was in Eden. We've already talked about mortal. Look at this word here now for immortal. It comes from a hybrid word, im meaning not and mortal meaning dead. An immortal entity, one who has been grafted into the vine called Yeshua, can stand up in front of any kind of sickness, death, and disease and say, "I am a living man. I am not dead. I'm not dead. Death does not work in here." And so what's happening is that Israel is being offered an opportunity to return to a pre-fall condition where they could have been echad, one with Yeshua, not dead, but alive in him. You and I now, as we speak, because of the bride's price, we are alive in him. And as a result, rather than officiate a system that offered up the blood of bulls and goats, Levi could have actually returned to the immortal position and role as the Melchizedek king and priestly order had been set in motion from Adam forward. Did you hear that? Any priestly system or temple plan who doesn't recognize Yeshua as its testator or grantor is a temple or a priesthood that's still officiating a whited sepulchre full of dead men's bones. It is still a covenant of death. Are you hearing me? In other words, while at Mount Sinai, Israel was literally paralleling the Genesis account. And they were being offered the opportunity to once again rectify things by eating of the tree of life, the Etz Chaim, rather than still consuming from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now look at that word Etz Chaim. It's a phrase that has a numeric value of 233. This is mind-striking because, again, we don't look for these. We look for them, but we don't just idly take them and try and make it fit the teaching or the message. It has the same numeric value as the word Bekorah. Bekorah means a firstborn, a new birth, something that's being born again. It's also referring to the firstborn son as it relates to inheritance. And so, if you just take the minute to look at Etz Chaim, the tree of life, and understand if you eat from the tree of life rather than the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, your DNA becomes changed, and now you are a firstborn son of Elohim. But it's also not an accident that Bekorah can also indicate early figs on a tree. And so now you understand why Yeshua had to curse the fig tree. It put out leaves, just like the leaves that were chosen by Adam and Chava to cover their nakedness. But because they had consumed death, they did not have the ability to produce living sons anymore or seed that would carry on the lineage of Yahweh. And so that fig tree today still is used to represent Israel and the system that produced a skin tent tabernacle man, and the Levitical order are still covered by the fig leaves of it. And rather than having it moved away to make way for the coming of the Son of Man, they are content to abide in the covering of carnality and death still working in that system. You cannot argue against that. You just can't. It's there because death works in that system. And so instead of consuming eternal life from the tree, Yeshua, there's the golden calf issue. And that golden calf issue becomes a mirror once again of the Genesis 3 account where Israel, Adam, eat from the tree of knowledge and once again lose their opportunity for immortality. While simultaneously death began its work in them. You remember that? Death not only works in them and it works through them. What happened after the incident there? All of the subsequent generations of the individuals in that generation die off. Death began to work in them. And so being mortal, having mort death working in them, they became the property of death, a slave to it, just like the original fallen Adam. On the other hand, we have the Melchizedek system. Melchizedek system, if you go back and look at it, Melchizedek had no origin, no beginning, no end. He was literally a figure of an eternal, immortal individual, immort, no death working in him, no death property in him. And listen to me, if you're part of the Melchizedek order and you serve the priest of that order, the high priest of Yeshua, then death cannot work in you. And so because of the rejection of the Melchizedek order and the opportunity to return to immortality at Gan Eden by accepting the redemptive plan of Yeshua, they chose instead to clothe themselves with their fig tree leaves and hide themselves from the presence of the Creator. And so that nation of mortals are now once again enslaved to death. And so the Melchizedek, who had no beginning, no end, the immortal one, could not be the priest over a dead system. Are you hearing me? Death and life cannot commingle. And so Israel, just like Adam, after the golden calf incident in Genesis chapter 3, and here at Mount Sinai, Israel has to be separated once more from the Melchizedek tree of life. I believe that the tree of life represented that priestly order. And so there's a predicament that takes place. And it requires, because they have to be separated from the tree of life, they have death working in them. And so it requires a different priestly system to officiate until death can be conquered once more. And so you have to bring in the Levitical system. And so now you understand why the prophecy regarding the fig tree blossoming in the end times is so pertinent. It ain't so much about the nation of Israel, in my opinion, as it is the house of Levi rising to power again, and they will never be able to produce living fruit. And it's a lying fig tree that is once more going to be confronted by our Messiah in the coming days, because it's lying about producing fruit. That blows my mind. Adam is put outside the camp. He's put outside of Eden, remember? Yahweh has to put him out. And so the tent of meeting, which represented that first Adam in the carnal flesh, is going to be used as a teaching tool to demonstrate the pattern of redemption, life after tamut. Can y'all get this? And so the tent of meeting, like Adam, has to be picked up and removed outside the camp, moved outside of Eden. Do y'all see that? And so Yahweh has to reveal a plan for redemption. And the plan to redeem the fallen Adam could not come by the blood of bulls and goats. I'm going to show you why they were allowed to sacrifice the blood from the bulls and goats. But the redemption plan had to come through an individual who would take on the same skin tint garment without sin in order to break the power of death upon the mortal man. The tent of meeting, listen to me carefully, it may upset you. The tent of meeting was like that cursed fig tree. It could only cover death. It had no living seed, and anyone that attended it could never produce living sons. On the other hand, the living stone tabernacle will be immortal. There will be no death working in it, and you cannot die inside the living stone's tabernacle. It's quiet in here, but this I challenge you to go back and look for yourself at this. Now remember, as a result of the molten calf incident, we have produced the wilderness tabernacle, the skin tent man, who, like Adam, had to be ostracized from the camp. The reason for that is because fellowship with Yahweh had once again been broken. Fellowship there with Adam, fellowship with Yahweh here again at Mount Sinai. And so the redemption plan revealed that mortality now works, death now works in the skin tent man, just like it did from the fleshly Adam all the way to that generation at Sinai, and then from there forward until our Messiah Yeshua comes. And so as they contract that dead man through their worship there of the molten calf, what have they done? They were told, the day that you touch it, you will mut tamut. And so not only is death working in them, but death now works through them. That's a sobering thought. How many of you have ever stopped long enough to think about the impact that your words and your life has on your children and your children's children and your children's children unto 1,000 generations? It's a sobering thing. Now, let me back up just a minute. I want to look at the Etz Chaim, the tree of life. Etz Chaim, not Ha-Etz Chaim, as it's shown first there in the text, but Etz Chaim, tree of life, has a value of 228. That is the same value of an interesting phrase, Masakah Egel, molten calf. Did you hear that? The tree of life is juxtaposed to this molten calf. The molten calf becomes a picture of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, which was intended as a counterfeit, just like the anti-Messiah is intended as a counterfeit to the Etz Chaim, the tree of life. There's a closely related word that can be extracted out of masakah, and it's the word nasak, and it means to cast something or to pour it out. They're casting this molten calf, but it also indicates as I'm casting it or pouring it out that the process is part of the anointing process to install a king, a melech. And so their debauchery, their sin as they cast or pour out the molten calf is indicating their choice of a new king over them, and they have just rejected the Melchizedek, the king of righteousness, and the priestly king whose rule over them would have been a rule of shalom. Remember the original Melchizedek in Genesis chapter 14? Where did he reside? Where was he king over? Shalom. Yeah, rule shalom. How many of you remember the declarations of the angels in Luke chapter 2, verse 14? As soon as Yeshua makes entrance into this fleshly tabernacle through the vestige of the woman, they speak to the people that were around them, and they say, glory to Yah in the highest, and on earth what? Peace. The opportunity to be reconciled to Yahweh. Peace and goodwill toward men. So you can see that there's an opportunity to rectify the enmity between man and Yahweh, and it comes only through the redemptive form of Messiah Yeshua. He's the only one that could come in this fleshly vestige here of carnality, sin, death, and disease without sin, and then be able to redeem us, set us free from the curse. The blood of animals could never do so. And so this molten calf event, instead of bringing a reign of shalom or peace, it actually brought enmity or war between Israel and Yahweh. And instead of installing Yahweh as the Melchizedek or Yeshua as a Melchizedek, it actually causes Yahweh here to become the Melech Milkama, a king of war. And it caused him to make war against him. And let me just break this down a little bit simpler for you. Romans 8:7 says, because your carnal mind is enmity against Yahweh. Wait a second. If I have a carnal mind, now he is the Melech Milkama. He is a king of war, and he has set himself against me. You cannot prosper in your relationship if you have a carnal mind. And so your mind has to be renewed. It's not, your mind, as it says here in this same text, is not subject to the law of Yahweh, and neither indeed can it be. And then look at Exodus chapter 15, verse 3. Yahweh is a man of war. Yahweh is his name. And so anytime we set ourselves in opposition to him, we become enemies with him. Now, I hope that you notice that word for the molten calf, masaka egel, but that word masaka is also closely related to that word we looked at earlier, masak, which means to remove someone out of their position. And as you remove them out of their position, it's prolonging the length of time that they stay in that position, and it also will then affect their ability to sow seed from that lower position rather than the position of immortality that they originally had with him. Are you hearing that? And so is it possible that this whole premise that the elite poured out on us of masking an entire generation of people could have been akin to prostituting the nations to another molten calf? Now, I've learned something, hopefully you have, from the distinction between the priestly orders. There's one that's eternal, immortal, and living. That's the order of Melchizedek. The other is temporal. It's mortal, and it's fraught with death, the Levitical system. And the Levitical system, neither the Kohanim nor their Levite counterparts are eligible to officiate what could have been a return to the immortal eternal. Why? Because it had a without beginning or without end. It was an eternal order, the Melchizedek system. And the reason that they could not officiate in that system is because they rejected the Melchizedek. They rejected him just like Adam did in Genesis 3. They reject him at Mount Sinai, and they reject him again later, 2,000 years when he arrives on the scene, and they're going to reject him in the coming days. And so like Adam at Sinai, Israel chose to officiate a system that was related to the molten calf. And thereby they embraced the tree of the knowledge of good and evil once more. And even the rabbis acknowledged this. It resulted in a daily reminder of their sin in the form of animal sacrifices. The reason that they were charged to sacrifice the animals was as a daily reminder of the sin of the golden calf. And they were forced to embrace, "These be thy gods, O Israel," rather than acknowledging the Lamb slain before the foundation of the world. And I am telling you, they wouldn't, if he arrived on the scene, they would not acknowledge him at present. So how can one presume to officiate at the throne of the high priest, the king, priest of the earth, when you don't even know who he is? And I am going to tell you that there is going to be a counterfeit Messiah crowned and made to sit on that third temple throne in the coming days. It's also worth mentioning that the Hebrew word for calf, egel, excuse me, can also be written, if you just rearrange the letters, ayin gimel lamed to gimel aleph lamed, gimel ayin lamed. They're etymologically interchangeable. And it can mean defilement, pollution, to make impure, to be defiled by blood. The Levitical system is defiled by bloodletting, and death works in whatever tabernacle they are custodians of until such time as Yeshua is able to offer himself as a sinless Adam and destroy the power of death. Can you see that? Excuse me for a second. Give Yahweh praise. The whole, and whether you don't have to agree with me. I honestly don't care. The whole animal sacrificial system was imposed as a form of punishment upon the entire nation of Israel. It served as a reminder. It was in their face on a daily basis to remind them of their compromise at Sinai with the golden calf. Now, as I said earlier, the Kohanim, the Levites, actually had an honorable role. Initially, they were supposed to teach Israel how to return to holiness, how to return to what was once an Edenic state. And they were called to do so by officiating in their roles as custodians of the 10th man who had been exiled from Eden and Yahweh. And their custodial responsibility would continue until such time as the last Adam, the king of righteousness, the Melchizedek, would arrive and establish a tabernacle not made with hands, called the tent of meeting. He meets you here. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, "I am the tabernacle of the Most High." The Hebrew term for tent of meeting is Ohel Moed. And it's not an accident that Ohel Moed has a numeric value of 156, the same value as the name Yosef, Joseph. Joseph is usually translated as to do again, to join oneself, or to be added to another. Yeshua came as the archetype of Joseph, acknowledged by both Judah and Levi as Mashiach ben David, Mashiach ben Yosef. They were actually expecting two Messiahs to appear. They were wanting to be liberated from the iron hand of the Roman government at that time. They were expecting Mashiach ben David to come and make war and liberate them. Instead, it was Mashiach ben Yosef who would come and redeem his brothers as a suffering servant. They didn't understand that. And so Mashiach ben Yosef became one who would do it again. In other words, he would become the one who would take on the skin tent and become the last Adam. And like the first Adam, he would go back down into Egypt, death, hell, and the grave on behalf of his brothers, just like Joseph did, and deliver them. Are you hearing me? Now I want to share this with you. 2 o'clock this morning, I believe Abba was speaking to me. And I'm convinced, just like the house of Joseph, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. I believe that we're on the cutting edge of the 7 years of plenty being shut up and over with. I believe we're about to enter a 7-year season of famine, much worse than what the original Joseph experienced. And even Hosea 8:11 speaks of a famine in the last days, but they refer to it as a famine of hearing the word. Listen to me carefully. Levi is going to officiate during this famine of 7 years. And as he's officiating in his role over a skin tent tabernacle that has death working in it. Listen to me. If Amos 8:11 is true and there's a famine of hearing the word of Yahweh, while he's officiating, it's going to be extremely difficult to hear Yahweh's voice. What does John 10 tell us? My sheep hear my voice. My sheep know my voice, and another they will not follow. It's interesting. As I was alluding to earlier, they're attempting to create an artificial intelligence who will speak to you, speak for you, speak on your behalf. And so is that going to be the voice that we're familiar with in the days ahead? The guy that I was listening to said that he will be this artificial intelligence will be so powerful that it will take a highly trained individual to tell that that is not, in fact, a living man. I'm telling you, seduction is already here. Are you listening to me? They're going to control every facet of your life and become the voice. Oh, I would never do that. You have already been set up. You've got to learn how to get this thing not removed, renewed. Don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed, not by the removing of your mind, but by the renewal of your mind. If your mind is being renewed, Abba began to speak to me a couple of years ago. Get your mind renewed. Get your mind renewed. You need to learn how to make the declaration of who you are and whose you are, and you need to understand that death does not have a right in me. Let me just share this side note. How many of you remember, since we were talking about Joseph, that Levi had also been complicit in selling Joseph into slavery? Okay? And I believe that it is, in fact, the house of Joseph that's being raised up and called the outcast. Okay? And so if we're coming out, it seems to me that if that was the original pattern, we need to be careful of Levi and some of our brothers, because they may be prone to try and sell us back into slavery. And I told you that it's Joseph that's going to come out of the dead, and it's Joseph who's going to access his inheritance, and it's Joseph who has been enslaved and has death working in and through him. And if Joseph was taken out of that dead type situation, and they can then turn around and sell you back into this same dead works, you need to learn how to repent from those dead works and not be trapped and seduced into going back in. Can you say amen? Remember the tunic that Joseph wore, called a coat of many colors. In Hebrew, the phrase was a ketonet pasim. Ketonet comes from a root indicating a linen priestly undergarment. It is my contention that Joseph not only was supposed to be, he received the role of the firstborn. It's ironic if you think about it. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah. I don't think Levi, Brittany and I were talking about it this past week, I don't think Levi still likes the idea that they lost their opportunity as the firstborn. Are you listening to me? And so you picture Joseph. Joseph, the outcast being gathered. It's in my opinion, apparent that the outcasts that are being together right now as we speak have a ketonet pasim on us, a priestly undergarment. But if you look at the root of that word ketonet, it comes from kataf, and then the tal pei root hints at something that is bejeweled, as you would take an ornament and just line it with jewels. And it also hints at a doorway or a side entrance. And it's interesting, if you go back and look at its place in all of your etymological dictionaries, it's right before the word katar or keter, meaning to encircle and to crown. Judah and Levi all understand Joseph's being gathered from the nations, and there's going to be an attempt to sell you into slavery. How so? You're going to have to convert before you can access this temple, and you'll be sold into slavery. Say amen or oh me, or you can choke. It's the truth. The word pasim comes from the plural form pas. It's usually translated as colors, but if you look at it, it hints again at the hand or the foot, just like the kaf gives us authority and ownership. The tunic that Joseph wore represented the Melchizedek lineage of king and priest, and ironically, think about this, Levi and his brothers choose to kill a goat a sacrificial animal and offer its blood in lieu of Joseph's blood. Remember, Joseph, Mashiach ben Yosef, he was a shadow picture of the coming Messiah. They rejected the blood of Joseph and instead offer up an animal to smear on his tunic, and they reject the coming Mashiach ben Yosef who arrived 2,000 years ago. Pay attention to that pattern, because Levi's lust for blood led to an everlasting legacy prophesied over him by none other than his own father. Pay attention to this. This is mind-staggering. Are y'all getting any of what I'm sharing? Genesis 49, 5 through 7. Simeon and Levi are brethren. I'm a father. I'm just going to be honest with you. I could look in hindsight at children and say, that child's an instrument of cruelty. But if this child had not been born, and I make these declarations over them, are you seeing what I'm saying? Simeon and Levi are brethren. Instruments of cruelty are in their habitations. Listen to this. Jacob is crying out, "Oh, my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly." Remember, there's no punctuations in the Hebrew language. "Mine honor, be not thou united. For in their anger they slew a man, and in their self-will they digged down a wall. Cursed be their anger, for it was fierce, and their wrath, for it was cruel. I will divide them in Jacob and scatter them in Israel." Pay close attention to the phrase, "Oh, my soul, come not thou into their secret, unto their assembly, be not united, be not echad." The Hebrew word here for secret is sod. It indicates a secret council from yesod, but it has the Semitic dalet root, which indicates to set something, to build a foundation for a building, and to place a building upon it. So it tells you when you hear that, something regarding their secret has to do with and I believe this is a future declaration, because you read it and you can tell, it has to do with the future foundation setting of a building by the hands of Levi. Assembly comes from the word kahal, an assembly or a congregation. But look at the individual Hebrew letters. The kuf points to the one that comes at the end, the one or that which comes at the end or the last. The hey lamed root is a verb that means to be carried away, exiled. Who is it that's coming at the end, at the last? Who was it that was exiled and has the opportunity to be set free? When I read this, it seems to me, oh, you're just pulling this out of context. This is what the Hebrew language says. To me, these definitions are a prophetic warning to the exiles. Turn to your neighbor and tell them, we've been exiled. To the exiles at the end or the last, and we're being warned to avoid becoming part of or united echad with their congregation, their assembly, in the building which they will set or place or found. That's in the Hebrew language. That's not just me coming up with, Daddy said that. And frankly, for any stranger or ger, whether you keep Sabbath or not, to be accepted by Levi, you're going to have to be required to be circumcised to the satisfaction of Levi. You believe that? If you're going to be part of the house of Judah and be in the temple in the days ahead, you're going to have to be circumcised. And I'm all for circumcision. But I don't want it to be compulsory. If my heart is not circumcised or my tongue's not circumcised, it doesn't matter if my male anatomy is circumcised. Does that make sense? But don't you ever forget the last time when Levi was involved in a great circumcision. And it just so happened it occurred in the place that belonged to Shechem. And if you study the inheritance, Shechem is part of the inheritance of Joseph. Are you listening to me? And that great slaughter occurred there. And so it's my contention that Levi has never forgotten that he stood in the role that had once been both king and priest of the nation. And listen, let me tell you this. Levi is going to do everything he can to force you to be circumcised according to his provision and plan. And when that happens, you're going to be in a weak condition. And you're not going to know the voice of the Elohim the way that we should know it, unless you're connected to him in an intimate way. And once again, I want to make it plain that I'm not against Levi. I openly embrace Levi and Judah both as brothers, as long as they don't usurp the king and priestly positions, which I contend no longer applies to either of them. And should Levi continue in his current role as it regards the third temple and the founding and setting of it, which would require the implementation of dead works once more of an animal sacrificial system, then I have to set myself in opposition. After all, I am not only Joseph, charged with keeping the custody of the Melchizedek order, but I'm also an Ivrit, a Hebrew. Ivrit means one that stands in opposition. And I'm standing in opposition according to the name that was declared over me. Let me carry this a little bit further. Let's talk a little bit about the tent of meeting in Herod's temple, which would have been what's commonly referred to as the second temple. We've looked really close at the blueprint or the pattern that was inherited in the skin tent or that wilderness tabernacle. Wouldn't you agree? And I also believe that each one of those became an object lesson in the futility of carnal man's approach to the Creator without faith in the coming Messiah. It was an act of futility to try and approach Yahweh if you deny Yeshua. And so the law that was given subsequent to the molten calf incident served as a specific curriculum that Levi, as a schoolmaster, a teacher of the curriculum, along with the Torah, was supposed to be used to teach the nation until such time as Yeshua arrived on the scene. Once Yeshua arrives on the scene, they should have honorably recognized who he was and passed on that object, that crown, that office to him. The skin tent pictured the role of Adam, as I said last week, and the role of the moon, as we discussed in part 1, no longer having light of its own, the Creator's DNA, working in or through it, it could only reflect light on occasion. And so, if you go back and look at the second temple, the artifacts that were missing in it, the Ark of the Covenant represented the king or priestly altar. The menorah represented the light that would issue forth and cause creation to be launched. And so that second temple had no light of its own. It could only reflect the presence on occasion. Excuse me, that was the tabernacle. Herod's temple had none of the above in it. It had no light at all in it. And so whose light would then shine in the second temple? All of the sages, everybody today points to the second temple and talks about how wonderful and holy it was, how kadosh it was. But I'm telling you, it could not have had the light of our Creator in it. And so the only light that it could have been in there was a fleshly, carnal light that it would have exuded from the one represented by the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, Halel ben Sakar, Lucifer, son of the morning. Oh, you're treading on thin ice, preacher. I don't know if I agree with you. The things that you're saying are definitely heresy. Herod's temple today is venerated by most Jews and Christians and Messianics and Hebrews as the holiest site that there is. But if you go back and do your research, you'll find that the second temple was actually a remodeling project of King Herod. And that King Herod, not only in conquering that area, not only did he murder most of the priests and most of the rabbis of Israel at the onset of his reign, but in the process he built several other temples to Caesar Augustus. And one of the temples that he built sat at Caesarea Philippi. This is interesting because we're talking about the architect of that great holy second temple. Are you listening to me? Caesarea Philippi was the place also known as Panion or Banyas, and it was located at the foot of Mount Hermon. And it's the place that you find where Yeshua takes his Talmudim, his disciples, and he famously declares to them, "The gates of hell shall not prevail against my church." Now, you probably won't understand this until you go back and do your research, but at the base of Mount Hermon, there was an opening in the ground, and it was out of the base of that mountain that the headwaters of the Jordan River came from. And that place at that time was also known as the gates of hell, because Mount Hermon was the place that the Nephilim were supposedly, go back and look in the book of Enoch, that Mount Hermon was the place that the Nephilim, the fallen ones, were supposed to have first set foot. Right at the base of that mountain was the gates of hell. Yeshua carries his disciples to the place that's dedicated to Caesar Augustus at this location and says, the gates of this place are the gates of hell, and they're not going to prevail against my church. Are you listening? And so I don't think that it's coincidental that there's a connection between that temple, those temples, listen to me carefully, that were dedicated to Caesar. We get our word Khazar from Caesar. And I don't think it's an accident that the future third temple, whose main aficionados, adherents, are also Khazarian Jews. And so what is this third temple going to be dedicated to, if not the Khazars, the Caesars? In finishing, Leviticus chapter 14, verse 45 says, and it's talking about leprosy inside a house. It says if you find leprosy in the house, that you've got to bring the priest, and it's got to go through a cleansing process, and it details the cleansing process. And then it says if you go back after the cleansing process and leprosy is still there, you've got to break down the house, all the stones of the house, and all the timber of the house, and all the mortar of the house, and you're to carry them forth outside the city into an unclean place. Now you know why Yeshua was executed outside the city, because he was the leprous Messiah. Are you listening to me? But if you back up and look at Herod's temple, Yeshua goes into that temple and he plants a whip, a scourge. And what is he doing? He's going in to cleanse the temple. Why? It has leprosy working in it. It has sin and death working in it. And Yeshua attempts to cleanse that temple. And it comes back, and after his resurrection, the temple is there. The middle wall of partition is broken down where everybody can see that leprosy is still in that house. 70 years later, every stone, every block, every temple of that leprous house is taken down and carried out and dumped outside the city. You be the judge, but I'm telling you, I was intending to deal with this third temple. The text, as I said, is regarding leprosy that remains in a house after an attempt to cleanse it. There was death working in that temple, and history again records it. Go back and research it. There was no Ark of the Covenant in it, no light, period. And so I did everything I could for the last two teachings to present some evidence to you. I'm quite sure that it rubbed the fur backwards of some folks, but every point that I've tried to make, everything I'm trying to establish, needs to be established by at least two witnesses, and I've given more than two witnesses to every point. You make the call. But as for me and my house, we are going to serve Yahweh. Hopefully you've enjoyed this teaching. Thank you. Shalom Aleichem.